Welcome back to another Before You Read lecture for the Reading the Bible course. And we continue to read through the literature of Kings. This Before You Read lecture will cover 1 Kings 17 through 22 and 2 Kings 1 through 8. Just so you have an idea of where we're going to go in this lecture, I want to first provide some comments about the sort of big picture in mind. What is the overall arc of this part of the story? And then I want to devote a section of the lecture both to the career of Elijah and to the career of Elisha, his disciple. Then I want to talk briefly about the rise and fall of kings in this period and offer a few reading strategies for your engagement with this part of Scripture at the end. To begin with this part of the literature, again, just some notes to keep in mind as you record or as you engage this material. The first thing to remember is that we are now in the stage of this literature where you will receive parallel accounts of kings. You'll receive some comments about the king in the north, in Israel or the capital of Samaria, and you'll hear about kings that are in the south, in Judah or the capital of Jerusalem. But we're also going to begin to learn more about kings in other parts of the region. So we'll hear a lot about the king of Aram, the Arameans. They are sort of always around the corner, it seems like, in this part of the literature. But we will also learn about the rise of Edom and even a little bit about Egypt. In terms of chronology, this part of the literature from 1st and 2nd Kings that we're focusing on really begins with the reign of Ahab, the king of Israel, whose dates are about 869 to 850, to the reign of Ahaziah, of the king of Judah, whose dates were roughly 843 to 842. And so Elisha, the disciple of Elijah, lives until the start of the dynasty of Jehu, who was ruling roughly 843 to 815. So we're talking roughly 20 to 25 to maybe 30 years of history. The other thing to note about this literature is that it has a sort of an episodic, almost back and forth nature to it. There will be chapters that are talking about kings and other kings in the region and their sort of political maneuvering, and then we'll all of a sudden learn more about these two famous prophets. So it sort of bounces from one to the other, and it's not always clear why or how the material is ordered. Finally, it's worth noting that although my lecture will focus on Elijah and Elisha, that they were actually two prophets among many. These prophets were known for their miraculous actions, their miraculous behavior. They were members, it seems, of larger collections or guilds of projects. They were often sort of walked this fine line with the kings of Israel or Judah by being their consultants, but also their critics. It's a really hard line to be one of support and validation of their decisions, but also critical of those decisions when they depart from what the prophet or what God through the prophet deems to be acceptable. We do see as well that there are claims to divine revelation, and oftentimes we see disagreement among the prophets. This has led to what John Collins calls the wait and see approach, which is essentially you're just waiting to see how an event actually turns out to determine if it was actually of God or not. Turning our attention now to the prophet Elijah. The prophet Elijah was active in the first half of the 9th century BCE, so roughly from 900 to 850 BCE. There is, among scholars, a dispute about the historical reliability of the narratives about him. In other words, we don't know a lot about him from other sources, and it's possible that the description of him is meant to evoke a figure like Moses or other people from the ancient world or from the biblical tradition. But we find narratives about Elijah primarily in 1 Kings 17, 18 and 19, and then 1 Kings chapter 21, and then 2 Kings 1 through 2. As you engage this material, you're going to find that Elijah is depicted as a healer or a miracle worker. He is able to create a bounty of food in a lack, and he's actually able to raise someone from the dead. In addition, Elijah is what Beth Glazier MacDonald calls a king breaker. Because of his connection with the divine, his declarations, his judgments have the ability to sort of break or unseat kings. You'll also remember probably that Elijah was an ardent opponent of Baal and of Ahab's wife Jezebel. And there is some notable encounters between Elijah and the followers of Baal. So what are some of the highlights of the story of Elijah? Well, in chapter 17, you're going to learn about Elijah the wonder worker. Most of his miraculous deeds are sort of confined in that chapter. But then you're going to learn in chapter 18 and 19 about this great showdown between the God of Israel and Baal. And there's this mountaintop showdown that we see where, there's water and there's fire from heaven, and it's cinematic almost in its description. But it's followed almost directly by Elijah's flight into the valley, flight into the wilderness. And in this wilderness, we see this despondency. Elijah all of a sudden thinks he's the only one doing God's work. He's the only one who's part of God's kingdom. And God reminds him that that's not the case. And it reminds us as readers that the experience of God, spiritual experience of God, is not always fantastic. Sometimes we experience God in the lows of the valley, in despondency and despair, as much as we see God sort of show up in fantastic ways. A final highlight from the the stories about Elijah is Elijah's interaction with regard to Naboth's vineyard in chapter 21. Again, this is a place where we see a king, much like King David, using his power for selfish gain rather than for the good of the community. And Elijah intervenes on behalf of Naboth, the sort of country owner of this field. And I think that this story really raises questions in the way that it portrays the king, but also in the way that it tells us about Elijah's place in society, the significance of the prophets in that society. So overall, as you look at Elijah, keep in mind how Elijah moves in his relationship to people and to kings. Be aware, Elijah will also provide instances of sacred violence, of what appears to be God-condoned murder and violence. And he appears, finally, as a prophet like Moses. How does his story resemble the story of Moses from earlier in the Bible? The second prophet that we will focus on in our reading is Elisha. We read about Elisha with an S-H-A in 1 Kings 19, in 2 Kings 2 through 6, 8 through 9, and then chapter 13. So again, you can see that episodic nature of this writing. We only get a brief mention of him in 1 Kings 19 as a disciple of Elijah, but little more after that. In 2 Kings 2, we see this elaborate and memorable transition of power from Elijah, the original prophet, to Elisha, his disciple. Elijah gives Elijah this mantle and then mysteriously ascends into heaven on a chariot. Elijah is one of the few people in the Old Testament who is said not to die. And this absence of Elijah allows Elisha to become the prophet. In 2 Kings, we see the activity of Elisha. He's also miraculous. Many of his miracles seem to parallel the miracles of Elijah. There are, I think, some more surprising or more, I don't know if funny is the right word, but, lighthearted miracles, like a floating axe head. And then there is also the story of Elisha and the little children chasing him around, calling him Baldy, which, as a person who's losing his hair, I kind of can resonate with this story. But it does not end well for these little children, and it's quite an interesting story. We see as Elijah did, he works with kings, especially the king of Aram in chapters 8 through 9 of 2 Kings. And in chapter 13, we see the death of Elisha. This literature, in addition to introducing us to Elijah and Elisha, tells us much about the kings of Israel and Judah. We learn about Ahab and Jezebel, who are really, really, really bad in the eyes of 1st and 2nd Kings. In fact, Ahab sort of becomes a standard of the bad. We see in 2 Kings 8:27, for example, that this line, he also walked in the way of the house of Ahab, doing what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So Ahab sort of becomes this paradigmatic bad person and bad king. We also see the Arameans, as I mentioned earlier, as the major rival in this section. We learn that King Ben-Hadad sieges the northern capital of Samaria in 2 Kings 6 through 7, and that things get so bad in that city that at least some members of the city resort to cannibalism for the sake of survival. And then there is, in chapter 7, this sort of miraculous flight of the Arameans. They're sort of surrounding the city, and for some reason, a miraculous reason, they leave the city, and Samaria is able to walk away at that point. There's also a good amount discussing Hazael, who Israel and Judah join forces with Hazael, and there's some interesting interactions with Elisha as well. We see in chapter 8 that Edom declares independence. So in this literature, the narrative about these kings, it's important to remember that there are gaps in the narrative. We don't get all that happened, or even all that we want to know that happened. There are standard introductions, very clear perspective on the part of the author about whether or not a king was good or wicked. There's also some sort of recollection of the realities of the narrative, that we see that at this time there was a regional tension and a great amount of instability. As we've talked about in the past, these weren't established nations. These are tribal groups and small city-states that are doing their best to survive. And so there's a lot of instability and tension along that road. In terms of reading strategies, my first suggestion is that you read for the overall flow. I will provide a table that provides the kings of Israel and Judah, so you can sort of help situate yourself on the chronology. But in general, try to read for that overall arc. My second suggestion is you might want to sort of choose your own adventure. Maybe you want to focus on Elijah and Elisha, or maybe you want to focus on the geopolitical events and the narratives around the kings and the falls of kings. Or maybe you want to pay attention to both. A third strategy is generally, what are the prophets like? What role do they play in society? How do they relate to other people and other institutions? And finally, we would be remiss to ask the question, where is God in all of this? Where do you see God interacting? Where do you see God talking, speaking, judging? Always pay attention to those things in the text, and what do we learn about God from that? Well, that's all that I want to say about this material for now. I hope that your reading is productive, albeit challenging, and I look forward to hearing what you see in and through these texts. Happy reading.